Welcome friend to this session of Abstract Factory pattern. In this session we will understand the fundamental of Abstract Factory pattern. We'll try to implement the same in a sample project and also look into the concept behind Abstract Factory pattern. Before we even start this tutorial, one of the very important thing is that if you have not read factory pattern, then it is very difficult to understand this pattern. So please first go through factory pattern. You can visit www.questmon.com to get the factory pattern video, because once you understand factory pattern, then abstract factory pattern is just extension of it. So as I said, that abstract factory pattern is an extension of basic factory pattern. It basically expands on the basic factory pattern. The main thing about abstract factory pattern is that it helps us to unite similar factory pattern classes into one unified interface. So what happens is basically, if you have a big project, and as your project proceeds, you create a lot of factory patterns in order to centralize the object creational code. Now as you move ahead in the project, you will at one point of time you will find that you end up with a lot of factory patterns. So with a lot of factory patterns in a project, probably you would like to consolidate them into one abstract factory and minimize your client code complication. So here's a pictorial diagram of it. So nothing special again. You have basically a lot of factory patterns, and rather than your client exposing to all this factory classes, what you can do is basically you can just consolidate them into one abstract factory and expose this to your client. Here's how the class diagram looks like when we try to understand. Here's a simple class diagram to understand the abstract factory. So basically you have product 1 who has a factory class which creates product 1, and then you have probably product 2 which has a factory class which creates product 2. So basically you have your individual factories. Now rather than client getting exposed to these two factories and increasing the client code complication, what you can do is that you can just put a interface abstract factory, which will unify both of these factories into one class, and the client code is exposed to the same. Second, we have also introduced an interface, as a thumb rule or as a golden rule to minimize your actual concrete classes exposure to the client code. Here's a simple project which basically discusses factory patterns practically. So basically here we have a button object, button class, and for a button class we have a factory button, a factory class called as CLS factory button, a text box class, text box object, and again we have a factory class which produces the text box object. Now what we do is that basically we introduce, rather than these two getting exposed to the client, what we do is that we introduce one more class, CLS abstract factory, who actually uses a get UI object method, get UI object function, and exposes both of these classes or both of these factory or factory classes to the client. So what happens is basically the CLS factory button class has a get button object method which helps us to get the CLS button object. The CLS factory text box has a get text box object. So what you have done is basically you have unified both of these functions into one function called as get UI object. So in short, you have simplified the client interface, the client interface to create factory objects. So now if you look at the client code, it's pretty neat. First thing, you can see that there is nowhere we have exposed both of these classes, or we have created, or we have used both of these classes in the client code. Basically we have used only one class, CLS abstract factory. So we have minimized our code, or we can say we have minimized our client interaction with both of these factory classes. Second, with the interface coming into picture, your client code is now only exposed through this interface, or you can say your concrete objects are only exposed through this interface. So thus we have completely decoupled these core 4 classes from the client code. So if we add one more class over here, a concrete class like let's say CLS list box, we don't need to recompile the client. if we add one more factory class here, we don't need to recompile the client. So these two classes stand like a decoupling barrier between the client code and the concrete classes. Let's try to look at a sample code. So what I'll do is that I'll just pull up my Visual Studio 2005. Basically, this code I have written in Visual Studio 2005 in C Sharp. So, but if you are a Java person, or even if you are a C++ person, you should be easily be able to map the implementation in your respective languages. We will discuss the same example which we discussed previously, that is the UI object. One of the things which you can always note for abstract factory pattern is that basically it's a rarely used pattern. First thing. Second, why rarely used pattern? Because if you design your factory classes properly, then probably you should not need abstract factory. But what happens is, normally we can say that abstract factory pattern can come as a consolidation point when you have too many factories. So practically what I see is that it's a rarely used pattern. It's only a pattern which you can use to consolidate factory patterns. Second, first thing, this pattern will never exist if there are no factory patterns. First thing. Second thing, if it ever exists, it is existing because probably you have too many factory patterns and you would like to consolidate them and minimize your client code complication. So as we discussed, here's a project, simple CLS button class, which actually will be used to display a button. CLS text box class, which will be used to display a CL or text box object. And then now we have individual factories for them. So here's the CLS factory button, which produces button object, CLS factory text box, which produces the text box object. Now what we do is basically we introduce one more abstract factory, which actually unifies them into one unique function, that is get UI object. And then depending on the type passed to this, it will either get you a get text box object, or it will either give you a text box object, or either it will give you a button object. So if you look at the client code which we had just seen, pretty simple. First thing, you can see that nowhere we are seeing both of the factory classes. We are only using CLS abstract factory. Second, you can see is that we are not using the concrete objects, we are only using the interface. So in this way your client code is modified. It's pretty simple. We have consolidated both these factory classes into one class, abstract factory. Now as I said, practically if you design your factory classes properly, you will rarely need this pattern. Second, it will be only needed when your project is too large, you have too many factory patterns scattered, and you find that your factory patterns have common, or you can say you find that there are two factory patterns who have common characteristics and common. Like example, over here we had a text box object, and then we had a button object. Both of them are UI objects. So it's they both have common characteristics, like the use it's like user interface. So probably the consolidation looks what you call logical. But again, as I said, if you design your factory classes properly, and if you control your factory classes properly, if you design them properly, you should not need abstract factory in practical sense. So that's what we have today for abstract factory. Any doubts, you can always email me at shiv_koiral@yahoo.com. Anything you think you can improve in this video, please mail me your suggestions. It's always welcome. And thanks for hearing us, and I hope that this session has made your fundamentals clear about abstract factory pattern.